morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as people hurried to their daily routines. Among the crowd, an elderly man named Harold sat quietly in his wheelchair near the entrance of Westminster Abbey. His weathered hands rested on a small sign that read Royal Navy Veteran, served 1942-1967. The metal wheels of his chair gleamed despite their age, and several military medals were carefully pinned to his worn navy blazer. Harold had made this spot his regular place for the past 3 years. Not because he needed money, but because he enjoyed watching people and sharing stories about his service days with anyone who showed interest. His pension was enough to live comfortably, but the loneliness in his small apartment had driven him to seek human connection on these busy streets. Tourists and locals alike passed by, some dropping coins into his small collection tin, others simply nodding respectfully. Harold always smiled and thanked each person, regardless of whether they contributed anything. His kind eyes and gentle demeanor had made him something of a local fixture that many people looked forward to seeing during their daily walks. On this particular Thursday morning, the street was busier than usual. A group of international tourists had gathered nearby, taking photos of the historic buildings and chatting excitedly about their London adventure. The sound of clicking cameras in multiple languages filled the air, creating a vibrant atmosphere that Harold found entertaining. Near the corner, 2 members of the Royal Guard stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. They remained perfectly still, maintaining their ceremonial duty with the discipline and precision they were famous for worldwide. Tourists occasionally approached them for photos, though the guards never broke their stoic composure. Harold watched the scene unfold with quiet contentment. He had always been proud of his country and its traditions, having served during some of the most challenging times in British naval history. The sight of the young guards reminded him of his own days in uniform, standing watch on the deck of a destroyer during stormy Atlantic crossings. A young mother with her toddler approached Harold's wheelchair. The child, no more than 4 years old, stared wide-eyed at the shiny medals on the veteran's blazer. Harold's face lit up as he gently explained to the curious child that each medal represented a different mission he had completed during his time at sea. The mother smiled gratefully, appreciating how patient and kind the old man was with her son. As the morning progressed, Harold noticed a commotion developing near the tourist group. A family had arrived with 3 children, and while the parents were busy taking selfies with the historic backdrop, their middle child, a boy who appeared to be around 12 years old, was growing increasingly restless and loud. The boy, dressed in expensive designer clothes and expensive sneakers, was clearly used to being the center of attention. When his parents told him to wait while they finished their photo session, his face twisted into an expression of annoyance and entitlement. He kicked at loose stones on the ground and complained loudly about being bored. Harold observed the scene with growing concern. He had seen many children over the years, and he could usually distinguish between normal childhood restlessness and genuine behavioral problems. Something about this boy's aggressive body language and the way he spoke to his parents suggested deeper issues with respect and discipline. The veteran hoped the family would move along soon, sensing that the child's mood was deteriorating rapidly. Unfortunately, his instincts would prove correct as the situation was about to take a turn that would shock everyone present on that busy London street. The boy's name was Marcus, and at 12 years old he had never been told no in any meaningful way throughout his entire life. His parents, wealthy technology executives from California, had always given him everything he wanted the moment he demanded it. They believed that providing unlimited material possessions would somehow make up for their constant absence due to work commitments. Marcus had grown accustomed to immediate gratification and had developed an explosive temper whenever things didn't go exactly his way. During their European vacation, he had already caused scenes at 3 different hotels, 2 restaurants and a museum, screaming and throwing tantrums until his exhausted parents gave in to his demands. As his parents continued their photo session, completely absorbed in capturing the perfect social media shots, Marcus's frustration reached a boiling point. He stomped his feet and shouted that he was tired of waiting, but his parents merely shushed him without looking up from their phones. "I hate this stupid place," Marcus yelled loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "These buildings are boring and old. I want to go back to the hotel right now," Several tourists turned to stare at the disruption, but Marcus's parents seemed oblivious to their son's behavior and the embarrassment he was causing. They had become so accustomed to his outbursts that they had learned to simply ignore them until he eventually tired himself out. Harold watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and concern. During his decades of military service, he had learned the value of discipline, respect, and consideration for others. He had also raised 3 children of his own with his late wife, and he knew that this boy's behavior was not normal or acceptable by any reasonable standard. The veteran considered wheeling himself away from the area to avoid any potential confrontation, but something kept him in place. Perhaps it was his ingrained sense of duty, or maybe just the hope that the situation would resolve itself peacefully. Either way, he remained at his usual spot, quietly observing the family drama unfolding just a few meters away. Marcus noticed that his shouting wasn't getting his parents' attention, so he decided to escalate his behavior. He began running in circles around the tourist group, bumping into people and knocking over a small display of postcards that a street vendor had set up nearby. When the vendor politely asked him to be more careful, Marcus stuck out his tongue and made rude gestures. The boy's parents finally looked up from their phones, but instead of disciplining their son, they simply called out, "Marcus, honey, please don't run so far away from us." Their tone was pleading rather than authoritative, and Marcus completely ignored them. Growing even more frustrated by his parents' weak response, Marcus looked around for a new way to express his anger and demand attention. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Harold, sitting quietly in his wheelchair with his veteran's sign and collection tin. Something about the old man's peaceful demeanor seemed to trigger even more rage in Marcus. Perhaps he was jealous of the respectful attention that strangers had been showing Harold throughout the morning, or maybe he simply saw an easy target who couldn't chase after him. Whatever his motivation, Marcus's expression shifted into a cruel smirk as he stared at the elderly veteran. Harold noticed the boy's attention and offered a gentle smile, hoping to diffuse any potential tension with kindness. Unfortunately, Marcus interpreted the old man's friendly gesture as weakness, and his mind began forming a plan that would soon shock everyone present and change the course of his young life forever. Marcus approached Harold's wheelchair with deliberate steps, his face twisted into an expression of contempt that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old child. The veteran sensed trouble brewing and instinctively tightened his grip on the arms of his wheelchair, though he maintained his calm demeanor. "Hello there, young man," Harold said gently, hoping to engage the boy in friendly conversation. "Are you enjoying your visit to London?" Instead of responding to the kind greeting, Marcus looked down at Harold with obvious disdain. "Why are you just sitting here like a lazy old man?" he sneered. "Don't you have a job or something better to do?" Harold was taken aback by the child's rudeness, but he had encountered difficult people before during his years on the street. He chose to respond with patience and understanding. "Well, I'm retired now, son. I spent 25 years serving in the Royal Navy, protecting our country and its people." Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically. "Big deal. That was like 1,000,000 years ago. Nobody cares about old stuff like that anymore." The veteran felt a pang of hurt at the boy's dismissive words, but he continued trying to connect with him. "Would you like to hear about some of the places I visited during my service? I saw many wonderful countries and met fascinating people from all around the world." "Boring," Marcus shouted, loud enough to attract attention from nearby pedestrians. "I don't want to hear your stupid old stories. You're just some weird old guy begging for money." Harold's patience remained steady, despite the increasing hostility. "I understand you might not be interested in history, and that's perfectly fine. But I'm not begging for money, young man. I have everything I need. I just enjoy meeting people and sharing experiences." The calm response seemed to infuriate Marcus even more. He was accustomed to getting dramatic reactions when he was rude to adults, and Harold's gentle composure frustrated him beyond reason. In his twisted 12-year-old logic, he decided that the old man needed to be taught a lesson about respecting him. Without any warning or provocation, Marcus suddenly lifted his foot and kicked Harold's wheelchair with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that it sent the elderly veteran lurching forward dangerously, nearly causing him to fall out of his seat entirely. The metal collection tin flew through the air, scattering coins across the cobblestones with a loud clattering sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Harold's military medals jangled against his chest as he fought to regain his balance and prevent himself from tumbling onto the hard ground. Several witnesses gasped in shock and horror at what they had just witnessed. A young woman screamed, "Oh my God! Someone help him!" while other pedestrians rushed forward to make sure Harold was okay. The veteran's weathered hands shook as he gripped his wheelchair arms, more from shock than fear. In all his years of military service, facing enemy fire and dangerous storms at sea, he had never expected to be attacked by a child on a peaceful London street. Marcus stood back and watched the chaos he had created with a satisfied smirk. Clearly pleased with the dramatic reaction he had finally managed to provoke, he showed no remorse or concern for the elderly man he had just assaulted, instead seeming to enjoy the attention his violent action had generated. The boy's parents, who had been completely absorbed in their phones, finally looked up to see what was causing all the commotion. When they saw their son standing near the overturned wheelchair and the crowd of concerned onlookers, their faces showed confusion rather than immediate understanding of what had happened. "Marcus, what's going on over there?" his mother called out casually, as if she was asking about the weather rather than addressing a serious situation involving her child. The two royal guards had been standing at their ceremonial post, maintaining their traditional stillness and composure despite the growing commotion nearby. These were not ordinary soldiers playing dress-up for tourists, but active-duty military personnel with extensive training and real combat experience. Sergeant James Mitchell, the taller of the two guards, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties. His partner, Corporal David Thompson, was a decorated veteran of both Iraq and Syria. Despite their ornamental appearance, both men possessed sharp tactical awareness and deep respect for fellow service members. When Marcus kicked Harold's wheelchair, both guards witnessed the entire incident from their peripheral vision. While their ceremonial duties required them to remain motionless during normal circumstances, they were also trained to respond to genuine emergencies and threats to public safety. Sergeant Mitchell made a split-second decision that would later be praised by his commanding officers. In one fluid motion, he stepped away from his ceremonial position and strode purposefully toward the scene of the assault. His heavy military boots echoed against the cobblestones as he approached, his impressive 6'3" frame casting a long shadow over the area. Corporal Thompson remained at his post but shifted slightly to maintain visual contact with his partner, ready to provide backup if the situation escalated further. Several tourists began taking photos and videos, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. When Sergeant Mitchell reached Harold's wheelchair, he immediately knelt down beside the elderly veteran, his ceremonial uniform pristine despite the urgency of his movements. "Sir, are you injured?" he asked in a clear, authoritative voice that carried the weight of military training and genuine concern. Harold looked up at the young guard with gratitude and relief. "I'm all right, son, just a bit shaken up. Thank you for coming to help." The sergeant helped Harold straighten himself in his wheelchair and quickly assessed him for any signs of injury. Satisfied that the veteran was physically unharmed, he turned his attention to Marcus, who was still standing nearby with that same arrogant smirk on his face. "Young man," Sergeant Mitchell said, rising to his full height and looking down at Marcus with an expression of controlled authority. "Did you just assault this elderly gentleman?" Marcus, who had never been confronted by anyone in a position of real authority, suddenly found himself face to face with a highly trained soldier who commanded immediate respect. For the first time in his life, his usual tactics of defiance and rudeness seemed inadequate. "He was just sitting there being weird," Marcus mumbled, his previous confidence beginning to waver under the guard's intense gaze. "I didn't do anything wrong." The sergeant's voice remained calm but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. "Sir, I watched you deliberately kick this gentleman's wheelchair without provocation. That constitutes assault against a military veteran, which is not only illegal but morally reprehensible." By this time, Marcus's parents had finally made their way through the crowd to see what was happening. When they saw their son being questioned by a royal guard, their first instinct was not concern for the elderly victim, but rather annoyance at the inconvenience. "Excuse me, officer," Marcus's father said in a condescending tone, "but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. Marcus is just a child, and I'm sure whatever happened was just an accident." Sergeant Mitchell turned his attention to the parents, his expression revealing exactly what he thought of their attitude and their parenting skills. "Sir, there was no misunderstanding. Your son deliberately and violently attacked this elderly veteran, I witnessed the entire incident, as did dozens of other people. Marcus's mother stepped forward with her phone already recording, clearly planning to use social media to somehow turn the situation to their advantage. "This is harassment of a minor," she declared loudly. "You have no right to intimidate our child." The sergeant's jaw tightened slightly, but his professionalism never wavered. He had dealt with entitled civilians before, though rarely ones quite this oblivious to their child's serious misconduct. The crowd that had gathered around the incident was growing larger by the minute, with people pulling out their phones to record what was rapidly becoming a viral moment. Among the onlookers was Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a retired headmistress who had dedicated 40 years of her life to educating children and had witnessed every conceivable type of behavioral problem during her career. Mrs. Hartwell had been shopping nearby when she heard the commotion and arrived just in time to see Marcus kick Harold's wheelchair. Unlike the other bystanders who were simply shocked by what they had witnessed, she felt a deep sense of moral outrage that compelled her to take action. At 72 years old, Mrs. Hartwell was a small woman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, but she possessed an inner strength and authority that had once commanded the respect of thousands of students, parents, and teachers. She had never tolerated bullying or cruelty in any form, and she was not about to start now. As Marcus's parents continued to argue with Sergeant Mitchell and defend their son's inexcusable behavior, Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult children and their enabling parents. "That is quite enough," she said in a voice that somehow managed to be both gentle and absolutely commanding. The authority in her tone was so natural and compelling that even the arguing adults fell silent and turned to look at her. Marcus, who had been emboldened by his parents' support and was beginning to smirk again, found himself face to face with someone who reminded him uncomfortably of his grandmother, the only adult in his life who had ever successfully disciplined him. "Young man," Mrs. Hartwell continued, looking directly at Marcus with the kind of steady gaze that seemed to see straight through to his soul, "what you have just done is not only criminal, it is morally repugnant. This gentleman served his country with honor and distinction, and he deserves your respect and gratitude, not your violence and cruelty." Marcus tried to maintain his defiant attitude, but something about the elderly woman's presence was making him increasingly uncomfortable. "Whatever, lady. Mind your own business." The words had barely left his mouth when Mrs. Hartwell's hand moved with surprising speed and precision. The sharp crack of her palm connecting with Marcus's cheek echoed across the street, followed by complete silence from the crowd of onlookers. The slap was not violent or abusive, but rather the kind of corrective action that previous generations had understood as necessary when a child's behavior crossed certain lines. It carried the weight of righteous indignation and moral authority that had been completely absent from Marcus's life until that moment. Marcus stood frozen in shock, his hand moving slowly to touch his stinging cheek. For the first time in his 12 years of existence, someone had held him accountable for his actions with immediate and unmistakable consequences. The experience was so foreign to him that he didn't know how to respond. "Now then," Mrs. Hartwell said calmly, adjusting her glasses and looking down at the stunned boy, "you will apologize to this gentleman immediately. You will help collect the coins you scattered when you attacked him, and you will learn to show proper respect for those who have sacrificed for your freedom." The crowd watched in fascination as this small, elderly woman accomplished what Marcus's parents, teachers, and countless other adults had failed to do. She had actually gotten through to him in a way that demanded genuine accountability. Marcus's parents started to object to their son being disciplined by a stranger, but Sergeant Mitchell held up his hand to silence them. "Ma'am," he said to Mrs. Hartwell with obvious respect and gratitude, "I believe you've just provided exactly the lesson this young man needed to learn." The silence that followed Mrs. Hartwell's corrective action seemed to stretch on forever, but in reality, it lasted only a few seconds before Marcus began to cry. These were not the manipulative tears he had used countless times before to get his way, but genuine tears of shock, shame, and confusion. For the first time in his young life, Marcus was experiencing real consequences for his behavior, and the weight of what he had done began to settle on his shoulders. The sting on his cheek was nothing, compared to the emotional impact of finally understanding that his actions had hurt another human being. Mrs. Hartwell watched the boy's reaction with the experienced eye of someone who had seen thousands of children work through difficult moments of personal growth. She could tell the difference between crocodile tears and genuine remorse, and what she saw in Marcus gave her hope that this incident might actually change his life for the better. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, so quietly that only Mrs. Hartwell could hear him at first. Then louder and more clearly he repeated, "I'm sorry." The elderly educator placed a gentle but firm hand on Marcus's shoulder and guided him toward Harold's wheelchair. "Tell him, not me, young man. He's the one you hurt." Marcus approached the elderly veteran with hesitant steps, his previous arrogance completely replaced by nervous uncertainty. Harold looked up at the boy with kind eyes that showed no anger or desire for revenge, despite what had just happened to him. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice shaking with emotion, "I'm really sorry for kicking your wheelchair. That was wrong and I hurt you and I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he might lose his courage if he spoke too slowly. Harold studied the boy's face for a moment, seeing the genuine remorse there. "I accept your apology, son," he said gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and try to do better next time." The veteran's gracious response seemed to affect Marcus even more deeply than Mrs. Hartwell's discipline had. Here was a man who had every right to be angry, yet he was showing kindness and forgiveness instead. It was a lesson in character that Marcus had never encountered before. Without being asked, Marcus began picking up the coins that had scattered across the cobblestones when he kicked the wheelchair. He collected each one carefully and placed them back in Harold's tin, even crawling under a nearby bench to retrieve the ones that had rolled the farthest. Mrs. Hartwell watched approvingly as the boy worked, then turned her attention to Marcus's parents, who were standing nearby in stunned silence. They looked like people who had just witnessed something completely outside their understanding of how the world worked. "Your son has just learned a valuable lesson," she said to them with quiet authority. "I suggest you think carefully about what kind of lessons you want to teach him going forward. Children need boundaries, consequences, and most importantly, they need to understand that their actions affect other people." Marcus's father opened his mouth to protest, but something in Mrs. Hartwell's expression made him think better of it. For perhaps the first time since Marcus was born, both parents were beginning to realize that their permissive approach to parenting might not be serving their child's best interests. Sergeant Mitchell, who had been observing the entire interaction, stepped forward with a small notebook in his hand. "I'll need to file a report about this incident," he said to Marcus's parents. "Assault on a military veteran is a serious matter, even when committed by a minor." The mention of official reports and potential legal consequences finally seemed to penetrate the parents' sense of entitlement. They began to understand that this was not just an embarrassing scene that would blow over, but a real situation with potential lasting consequences. As the immediate crisis subsided, Harold made a decision that would prove to be the most important part of the entire incident. Instead of pressing charges or seeking punishment for Marcus, he asked Sergeant Mitchell if he could speak with the boy privately for a few minutes. The veteran wheeled himself to a quieter spot near a small garden area, motioning for Marcus to follow him. The boy approached nervously, still sniffling from his tears and unsure of what to expect from this man he had so cruelly attacked just minutes earlier. "Sit down here beside me, son," Harold said gently, patting a nearby bench. "I want to tell you something important." Marcus sat down reluctantly, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground in shame. Harold studied the boy's profile for a moment, seeing something in his posture that reminded him of his own grandson, who lived far away and rarely visited anymore. "When I was about your age," Harold began, "I was angry about a lot of things. My father had died in the war and my mother was working 3 jobs just to keep food on our table. I felt like life was unfair and I took that anger out on people who didn't deserve it." Marcus looked up with surprise, not expecting the old man to share such personal information with someone who had just hurt him. "Really?" he asked quietly. "Really," Harold confirmed with a sad smile. "One day I was particularly nasty to an elderly neighbor who was trying to be kind to me. She could have reported me to the authorities or complained to my mother, but instead, she sat me down and told me something I never forgot." The veteran paused, making sure he had Marcus's full attention before continuing. "She said that anger is like a poison that we drink hoping it will hurt other people. But the only person it really hurts is ourselves." Marcus considered these words carefully, feeling their truth in a way that surprised him. "Is that why you're not mad at me now?" he asked. "I'm not angry because anger won't help either of us learn or grow," Harold explained. But I am sad, Marcus. I'm sad that someone so young already carries so much anger inside him. And I'm worried about what will happen to you if you don't learn to control it. For the next 20 minutes, Harold shared stories about his military service. Not the exciting adventure tales that Marcus might have expected, but stories about discipline, responsibility, and the importance of treating others with respect and dignity. He talked about the friends he had lost to war and violence, and how those experiences had taught him to value peace and kindness. Marcus listened with growing fascination, asking questions and showing genuine interest in the old man's experiences. It was the first real conversation he had ever had with an adult who treated him as someone capable of understanding important concepts, rather than just a child to be indulged or ignored. When they rejoined the group, Marcus's parents were shocked by the change in their son's demeanor. Instead of his usual sullen defiance or manic attention-seeking behavior, he seemed calm and thoughtful. More importantly, he seemed genuinely remorseful about his actions. Mrs. Hartwell approached Harold with obvious admiration. "That was beautifully handled, sir," she said warmly. "You've given that boy something far more valuable than punishment. You've given him understanding." The veteran smiled and shook her hand gratefully. "And you gave him something equally important, ma'am. You showed him that actions have consequences. Together we might have actually made a difference." Before the family left to return to their hotel, Marcus asked Harold for his address so he could write him letters. The veteran gladly provided it, sensing that this boy might genuinely benefit from having a positive adult influence in his life. 6 months later, Harold received a package from California containing a lengthy handwritten letter from Marcus and a photo of him volunteering at a local veterans' home. The letter described how that day in London had completely changed his perspective on life, and how he was working hard to become the kind of person that Harold and Mrs. Hartwell would be proud of. Harold kept that letter in his jacket pocket for the rest of his days, proof that even the most difficult children can change when someone takes the time to show them both consequences and compassion. The incident that began with cruelty and disrespect had ultimately become a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of human connection to transform lives.